Hello and welcome. I'm going to present on reflective practices in health interpreter education in New Zealand. So I'll give you a little bit of background to the study, why we've introduced reflective practices, a little bit of literature review, and also some background information on New Zealand, the diversity and the top languages requested by health interpreting services in particular. Then a little bit about the method and our analysis of student reflections and some discussion. This is my book, Introduction to Healthcare for Interpreters and Translators, which has appeared in many languages, including Korean. So you can see that healthcare interpreting is my passion. It is very clear that when we train students to interpret in healthcare, we need to actually make sure we give them the skills to become reflective, aware, and resourceful practitioners. And that will stand them in good stead for the rest of their professional lives. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about our type of interpreter education. We prepare interpreters for work in public service settings. Some scholars refer to these as community settings, including healthcare. And I would say that about 95% of the work in New Zealand takes place in healthcare settings. So in our classrooms, we have students representing a number of different languages. Some languages have a lot of medical vocabulary. Some languages do not, and I'll come back to that later. We also have both signed language interpreters, New Zealand Sign Language, which is one of the official languages of New Zealand, and different spoken language interpreters. And that's important because it means that we as the lecturers are not able to give language-specific feedback to students. So when we post interpreting exercises, and we usually use authentic exercises, so clips taken from documentaries on television about New Zealand or Australian health settings. Students interpret those. They can pause them when needed and interpret, and then we ask them to play back their recording and reflect on how they did. They also get feedback from their same language peers. We got ethics approval for this study. Because we are in a student-teacher relationship, we cannot ask students to assist with the study in the year that they study with us. We have to wait for them to finish their studies, so they're no longer in a student-teacher relationship with us, because that would be a power imbalance, and students might feel coerced. I always come back to Silvia Bernardini, who wrote in 2004 that it is important that we prepare people to be aware, resourceful, and reflective practitioners. In my classes, I use situated learning, so I try and bring the outside world of medicine into the classroom in a lot of different ways. And it's non-language specific interpreter education. We use reflective blogs, and I'll talk about that. And we ask students to reflect on pragmatic equivalence. What was the intent of the speaker, and how would you convey that in your language in a way that is pragmatically equivalent? Several scholars have commented on the importance of self-reflection for interpreters, and Lee said that self-reflection is a critical professional skill, and they can use that to develop improvement strategies and design their own roadmaps for skill and knowledge acquisition. There's not much in the literature about the link between reflective practice and deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is defined by Erickson as a type of focused, goal-oriented practice that is part of the process of developing expertise. But in my mind, deliberate practice can only take place when student interpreters can identify and then define the areas that they need to focus on, and then they can develop strategies for improvement. And in this study, We had 2 different cohorts, as I said, spoken language interpreters and the sign language interpreters. They were sharing the same courses on healthcare interpreting, but the sign language interpreters were doing it as part of a 3-year Bachelor of New Zealand Sign Language Interpreting degree. And that gave them a lot of extra tools to be able to reflect on their own renditions, as we shall see. Bin Ha Hua Wang also wrote that developing students' interpreting competence not only requires systematic training of interpreting skills, but also sufficient, authentic, and deliberate practice. And that's why we use authentic audiovisual clips. It's like the students are there, but they're not there. They're in the safe language environment. And here you can see that New Zealand is a very diverse country. About 40% of people in Auckland, which is where our university is, were born overseas. And the main languages, the top 6 languages, are Mandarin, Cantonese, Samoan, Tongan, 2 Pacific Island languages, Hindi, Punjabi, and Korean. And that is why we need non-language specific translator and interpreter education. We cannot offer 200 different courses with different language tutors. So the interpreting tasks, students interpret in the classroom, but also in the language lab. And they record that so they can reflect on it. And some students have languages with very limited medical terminology. For instance, Pacific languages, New Zealand Sign Language only has about 40 medical signs. And then some refugee languages where refugees have not been able to attend education in their home language. So they haven't learned all those specific technical terms, and especially medical terms in this case. So because we're unable to give the language-specific feedback to enhance students' interpreting skill development, we ask them to reflect on their own practice. So they play the audiovisual clip, interpret, pause as needed, play it back, reflect on their own strengths and weaknesses, and then they ask a language peer to give them feedback. And there's a roster, students make their own rosters. So the Mandarin speakers, for instance, will give each other feedback. This year we only had 2 Korean students, and so they gave each other feedback every week. I have not included their findings because that's still in our classroom. So hopefully next year I'll be able to. So this presentation, I'll talk about the reflections of semester 2, healthcare interpreting students. And in semester 1, we go through the body using this book, Introduction to Healthcare. This is the one for Chinese speaking interpreters and translators. And then so we go through the different organ systems. In the second semester, we look at specialist healthcare areas, such as oncology. So that's the study of cancer. And in oncology, there's often bad news interviews. So we had an audiovisual clip of a bad news interview. So the aim of the study was to see whether reflective blogs would benefit students and what common themes might come up so that we could actually then pay more attention to those in classes for next year, etc. So the audiovisual task was a bad news interview. So as I said, they post interpreted practice in VoiceThread. At the moment, we're still using Blackboard. We are moving to Canvas. Student recordings appear under their initials, and so they can recognize who has recorded and posted what, and then give feedback to people in their own language groups. A total of 19 students gave permission for the author to look at their reflections, and so these are last year's students who gave permission. They were given information by a third party, they were consented by a third party, and then I undertook a thematic analysis of the reflections of all the students who had agreed to participate. So the audiovisual clip, which I have not included, is a bad news interview, an Australian doctor and an Australian patient in this Prince Alfred Hospital, where the doctor gives the patient some bad news. He has stomach cancer He's initially thought that he might be able to be operated on, but then the doctor says, no, unfortunately, it has now spread, and the scans have shown that, and so there's no point in operating on you because experience shows that that doesn't actually cure you. So framework for reflections were also Kubler-Ross, who wrote about bad news interviews and how people respond to those, demand control theory, the different codes of ethics, and Calgary Cambridge framework that talks about how medical interviews are usually ordered, structured. So this is the instructions we gave to students, 3 things that went well, 3 things that went less well, strategies for improvement. And typically, the same was asked of the same language peers, but typically, initially, that'd be very vague, and then I would give them feedback and say, can you please be more specific? So this is the background to the audio-visual clip. You can see the setting, Prince Alfred Hospital in Australia, and Doug and Dr. Story, who is the gastroenterologist. So he specializes in stomach and bowel problems. Examples of reflections from the NZSL, the New Zealand Sign Language students, were very in-depth, and you can see they had to expand on things like chemotherapy. So there is no sign, there's no one sign. So very often these students have to develop the signs, or they have to find out what the signs are. And if there are no signs, then they have to find a way of signing so that it becomes clear what's going on. Some said there were still instances of English source text and when they signed. And New Zealand Sign Language and English are very, very different. So paraphrasing is very important for New Zealand Sign Language students, and the same goes for Pacific languages, so Tongan and Samoan, and some refugee languages. They have to unpack. So one person said that for the word malignant pleural effusion, they had to say in Samoan, there's a lot of fluid in your chest because of the seriousness of your lung cancer at the moment. And so you can see that to unpack, you have to really understand what the word means. I sometimes say it's easier for us with languages where there is medical terms, because we just have to say, okay, the Dutch word in my case for malignant pleural effusion, I don't even have to understand what it means. But those students really understand what it means, and so they can paraphrase and unpack. Spoken language students said that the idiomatic language, the informal language used by both the doctor and the patient, was problematic. So for instance, the PET scan has thrown up some more questions. It's like throwing up questions has resulted in some more questions. We just got to go on the odds. That means we have to go on the evidence, what will work and what won't work. I still want you to be nodding. I still want you to be saying that, yes, I can have treatment. And then the doctor says, you might take what is referred to as the South of France option. And people were really thrown by that, except for the New Zealand Sign Language students. They got it straight away because they're native English speakers, and they had this association with the South of France, relax, enjoy your days. And that's exactly what it meant. So the spoken language students, so they might be from a lot of different countries, they said, we obviously need to learn more informal language because we don't understand it, even in context. And so to do that, we might have to watch a lot more authentic health-related documentaries. And then as we watch them, try and interpret what people are saying. Intercultural issues were also the fact that the doctor was not telling the family. He was telling the patient and his wife directly. He did that in a very lovely, gentle way. He didn't say, sorry, there's nothing more we can do, you're going to die. He said it in a very roundabout way. And so, for instance, he said chemotherapy doesn't really work for stomach cancer. Well, I mean, our experiences with that are not good. That can be taken both ways, but we've just got to go on the odds and take the fact that you're feeling well and you might want to take what's referred to as the South of France option. And Doug, the patient, said, I still want you to be nodding. I still want you to say, yes, you can have treatment and can be cured. So the doctor didn't say outright that there was no curative treatment option. He was very gentle. And some of the students said, well, the doctors in our countries are not that gentle. They don't talk to patients directly, and they're very authoritative. So this is all, culturally speaking, we can interpret it, but it's a bit of a shock. And some students said, well, the whole thing is so sad, it made me cry. So I would really have to also work on being in the moment and trying not to be, taken over by my emotions. So the findings aligned with some of my previous findings where I looked at paramedic language and how student interpreters cope with that. And my main findings were that in New Zealand and Australia, you might hear health professionals say, how's it going, darling? Instead of how are you, Mrs. Lee? So they can be quite informal, and they do that to make the patient feel reassured and calm, but it can be quite offensive in other languages. So students said, well, we'd probably have to say, how are you, Mrs. Lee, way more formal, to actually have that pragmatic equivalence, which is not to offend, but to make people feel at ease. So there were several broad themes. Cross-cultural issues were very important, and the use of informal language, and also the non-verbal messages and how important they were. So how much easier it is maybe to actually be there with the patient and to see what's going on and get a sense, rather than to say maybe do the interpreting over the telephone, because how can all these non-verbal messages really add to the understanding. And then the New Zealand Sign Language interpreters were actually able to link their reflections and their peer feedback and the reflections on the peer feedback to deliberate practice. They then identified what they had to work on more. For instance, the use of classifiers in New Zealand Sign Language. So almost all of the participants included the code of ethics and how important that is. Also to be familiar with the 5 stages of grieving, and with the fact that the doctor in this case softened medical reality, but that actually helped them. So initially, as I said, students gave very general, unsubstantiated statements, so no evidence. They said, oh, I was very accurate, or I made some omissions, and I'd say, what did you omit, and why do you think you omitted it? So as the term went on, they became much more specific. Students who were very specific about areas for improvement were then able to engage in deliberate practice, and they then really tended to do well in the interpreting exams. So that goes to show that the reflective practice was very beneficial to students. Students who didn't do that were less able to improve, and that should be less with 2 S's, of course. So a student formulated strategies for improvement based on both their own reflections, but most found that the feedback they got from same language peers was extremely useful in improving. And that then helped them to come up with specific examples of what they needed to work on. So those students who were very honest in their self-reflections, who were very critical, tended to improve the most. Students who received constructive feedback from their peers and took it to heart went on to improve and do well in the interpreting tests. And New Zealand Sign Language interpreting students in particular were very collegial and went to great depths to provide constructive and encouraging feedback to the other sign language students. And I think that was also because they were together in the same group for 3 years, and they'd go on deaf camp and spend quite a lot of time together. So the findings suggest that most students do develop pragmatic competence through self-reflections and reflecting on feedback. Some students' self-reflective ability did not improve, and there could be a number of reasons for that. Maybe they didn't want to accept any form of criticism because they felt really threatened by that. Sometimes they just didn't have the ability to think about language and interpreting to be able to pinpoint the problem area. So that's a lack of metalinguistic skills. And As I said, I think that other educators will find this approach very beneficial to help their students develop into aware, resourceful, and reflective practitioners. So yes, students are able to develop pragmatic competence through self-reflection and through reflecting on peer feedback. And other educators in other countries who may at the moment be doing language-specific interpreter education may find that they also have to start looking at non-language specific interpreter education. So with students from different linguistic backgrounds working with different language pairs, and they may find this approach with reflective student reflections very beneficial. We actually make it a compulsory part of assessment. And that's me for today.